do.
A call to order. Let's stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Carol, do you want to take the roll call, please?
Lorraine Cost,
Here.
Charlie Venuto,
Here.
John Byron,
Here.
Vinnie Taranto,
Here.
John Windsor,
Here.
David Lane,
Here.
Karen McLaughlin, Stephanie Ellie, John Durkee,
Here.
Courtney Barker, Todd Swingle,
Here.
Jean Artusa, Danielle Bowden.
Here.
Terry Casto is traveling this week and is asked to be excused. And we haven't heard from Karen. Stephanie.
Okay, great. Great. So do we have a motion to approve the agenda? Courtney, John seconds. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, motion passes, and the minutes.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes, but I wanted to make a comment. I wasn't sure whether it was, I should do that before the motion or after the motion.
I think discussion is after the motion.
Okay.
So John moves to
Yeah.
approve the minutes.
Second.
Another John seconds, and the
The discussion item was on the announcement of the MIMS dredging project, nearly ready to start, getting ready to start. It gave the impression, if you weren't familiar with dredging projects, that you might see a dredge device in MIMS pulling the muck out, like today. And that's not the case. It takes months of setup time, preparation, and that's before the physical dredging process starts. And Matt mentioned that in his presentation several meetings ago. I mentioned it during my presentation too. It's just important for the public to know that when something is announced that it's about to happen, the O'Galley dredging project was announced 2.5 years ago. It's just getting started. Okay? So I just want to make it
Do
clear.
you suggest we amend the minutes?
I don't think it's necessary to amend the minutes, but I just wanted to make that comment.
Okay, so we have a motion to approve the minutes. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
The motion passes, and the monthly report. Virginia.
Well, this last month has been largely absorbed by taking everything that this committee has recommended and the county commission has approved and putting that in the form of a budget package for next year. In addition to that, we've advertised 5 of the 6 positions and received 91 applications for those. One of the 5, we only received 1 application, so we're re-advertising that one. The 6th position, we've been holding off on to try to see what we get with the first team and what niches we still need to fill, and then customize that position to fill any gaps. The first cost share contract for those substitute projects was executed with the city of Rockledge, and you have a template that was distributed this morning that's going to the county commission on Tuesday of what all of these city cost share contracts will look like. And I wanted you to have that because we had you recommended some guidance criteria of how we award these dollars to make sure that we are spending the funds the way the public expected us to spend the funds. So paragraph 15B on page 7 addresses the issue of if cities, or if whoever the recipient had already budgeted for the project, and these dollars are displacing dollars that they had already budgeted, then those dollars that they save have to get rolled into another lagoon project within the next 5 years. So that paragraph is in there, and that language has been worked on tediously by the county attorney's office and multiple city attorneys. So I think we finally found language that works. Also, attachment B of that template near the back is a progress report form that we'll have the cities submit regularly so that we can track progress on those projects. And then also important to the committee, the very back page, attachment E. This is how we are making sure that the sum of all of the various grants that any of these projects may have received, plus the lagoon tax, doesn't exceed the cost of the project. So this is also a responsibility of the cities to report this information to us, and we adjust the lagoon tax cost share down so that we're filling a gap, we're not exceeding a gap. Additionally, as a part of putting together that template and the agenda item for the board, I put together a list, it's a 3-page list that incorporates both all of the substitute projects plus all of the projects that were in the original plan that are also proceeding in years 0 and 1. Because all the original projects were in one document and all the substitute projects were in another document, people tended to go straight to that substitute list and think that that was all that we were doing. That is about half of what we're doing. So this is a list of everything that is moving forward, getting started in years 0 or 1. So you have that list. We have started, we pulled the trigger on utilities going out to RFQ for consultants to start design of 3 of the sewer utility expansion projects. As we've already talked about, the status of the MIMS muck dredging, so that the pre-qualification committee made their decision that Florida Dredge and Dock was the successful low-cost bidder, but the ink is still wet on those contracts. And so then there will be a time period of establishing the dredge material management area before the dredge arrives. So as John mentioned, the dredge won't be here for another few months. We received the last federal permit required for the original 5 muck dredging projects that we started working on a little over 2 years ago. And Matt, a big sigh of relief, or dancing in the hallways or something. So we have one DOT permit left that we still have to obtain, but yeah, the hard ones are in. So that's exciting. And we have worked on the first effort to measure the success of these projects. So we work with the city of Rockledge and their consultant on how to establish, how to set up wells and measure the groundwater concentrations with the septic system still there, and then continue those measurements during the removal and after the removal, and look at how this first septic to sewer project changes those groundwater conditions that are impacting the lagoon. Also on Tuesday's County Commission agenda, this will be the first grant coming to the county that we are passing through to, in this case, 4 municipalities for upgrading 10 baffle boxes. We have a muck finder app that we've been working with Leesa Souto at MRC and John Treffry's team at Florida Tech that will allow volunteers to be trained and go out and collect information on where the muck is and the depth of the muck, and provide that information to us so we can track how muck changes and where it is, so we can better target these projects going forward. So the first training session will be next Tuesday, and we're looking forward to seeing how that goes, and appreciate the partnerships that have come together to make that happen. At a prior meeting, when we were talking about the research that Florida Tech has been doing related to muck, Dr. Waite mentioned an intellectual property issue, and so the university has provided that disclosure statement to us. That starts a 90-day clock for the county to determine whether they want to be a part of that intellectual property. And so on Tuesday, we're asking the county commission for permission to negotiate what that means with Florida Tech and how we may share that intellectual property going forward. Busy month of meetings, as always, a lot of interest from county commissioners. And immediately following last month's meeting, you heard from Dr. Martha Monroe. She is under contract to do some work for the NEP, and so that afternoon she was holding a session. We coordinated that to cover her, so that the Lagoon program was covering her expenses to be here with us last month. She held a session on understanding citizens' knowledge, attitudes, and actions regarding the lagoon, and we hope that that will provide baseline information for all of the different government and nonprofit groups that are doing outreach and education related to the lagoon, so we know what we're working with. John Byron put me in touch with where did that one go? Matt Sussin at the school board, and we are working on a grant application that's going in today to work with, they're setting up, in my mind, they're vocational schools, but they're teaching students carpentry skills. And so they need carpentry projects to work on. And so we've proposed a project of building rain benches. So a rain bench is the same concept as a rain barrel, but it holds a lot more water than a rain barrel, and you can sit on it. And so they're going to be building a few dozen of these things and putting them around schools and using them to irrigate plants that are going to be growing in greenhouses that they are also putting up, and those plants will be available for living shoreline projects. So we're excited about that partnership. The University of Florida, a researcher, Evan Bean at the University of Florida, reached out to us about a septic to cistern pilot project idea that he had. So when we are connecting previous homes with septic to sewer, and typically you would abandon that septic tank, you would backfill it with sand. Instead of backfilling it with sand and having a large lump of something under the ground in your yard, this would direct the runoff from your roof into the cistern, and if the cistern leaks, then this could be a way to put in some denitrification media, clean that water up, and have it trickle into the groundwater, recharge our groundwater, and stop all that stormwater runoff and turn it into clean groundwater. If the tank is not leaky, then we can set up a small pump and a float switch, hook that up to the irrigation system, and draw from that source first. And then when the tank is empty, it'll draw from whatever the irrigation system was hooked up to in the past. So we've identified some pilot project sites for that and are submitting an application, a grant application on that today. Also met with Hub SeaWorld Research Institute. They're working with Sea and Shoreline, trying to get federal funds to set up a seagrass nursery down in the South Beaches that would be available for restocking seagrasses in the lagoon. And Congressman Posey's DC staffer, Tim Wilt, was down here looking at all of our federal needs that they could support. And so we talked about lagoon needs and the various ways that federal funding might support those. So that's the progress report. And we need to pick a topic for your next meeting. On the agenda under new business, and Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind me taking this out of order.
Sure, go ahead.
I would like to propose that we take we all take the month of June off. And let me get staff hired and let us, get things running, and then come back to you with a full team of folks and a plan to move forward. But I would like to know what you would like on your next agenda, whether that be June or July. The top of the list there is seagrass. So that would be the default topic unless you propose something different.
I have two suggestions. Number one, I'd like to have someone discuss monitoring from either St. John or Orca or both, and an attempt to try to establish a baseline so that we know that we're making progress. I know there's a new, Matt and I were talking about, there's a new St. John's monitoring station in the Banana that just went live this week. The other one I had noted on was the status of seagrass and replanting efforts throughout the lagoon. Those are two topics I think that would be interesting.
Go ahead, John.
A question for you. You've got a number of topics teed up. Some of them aren't quite right. The overall conservation plan for Lagoon, I don't think is done yet. But we also know that we're going to be extraordinarily busy starting probably November, December timeframe and in there. These topics that are information, educational in nature, certainly for the general public, but especially for us, are going to get sprinkled along in there. And so I think the question that, the answer to your question, should we take June off or not, and maybe August too, is are we, given the future time constraints we're going to have in meetings either side of the first of the year, are we going to be able to get these topics in? And there's prioritization there. There's some things that we can easily kick off until after our busy season. But I think the answer lies in these are important topics. Is a decision to take June off and thereby not take up one or two topics equivalent to a decision to kick it all the way to next June. So that's a question. I don't know the answer to it, but you have some sense of how much time each of these are going to take on our agenda and so on. And I think that's where it lies.
Yeah, that was my concern as well, though I really sympathize with you needing the time to get your staff in order and your team together.
Well, we have 6 more meetings between from July through December, and the next round of substitute projects, according to that draft schedule at the bottom of the page, would be January and February.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So, you can look at that list of future topics and decide whether, whether you want all of those to happen by December, or whether some of these can, slide to after that next round of substitute projects. Mm-hmm. The point about the Lagoon Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan, there is an existing one, there is an update that's underway. Mm-hmm. So that would be a logical one to push off until the new update is available.
Madam Chairman, I have a two-part motion. Part one is that we cancel the June meeting. Part two is that we give you the franchise to work directly with Dr. Barker to work out the future scheduling of topics for the meetings between now and the end of the year.
Okay. Do I hear a second? Do we need to, a two-part motion, we
You need
just
1
pass
second.
it with 1 second?
Yeah.
Second.
Stephanie seconds. All those in favor?
We had discussion for a
Ah,
second.
yes.
I'd like to back up John's comment. I'd like to see the, in terms of priorities, the monitoring performance and measuring success. I'd like to see that as a higher priority item.
Okay.
Madam Chair,
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of see where we go with the communication strategy before we decide on the next meeting. Just because if there is something that gets pushed, I wouldn't want to have to wait 60 days for us to make another decision on it. Not pushed on it, but after our discussion, wherever it leads us. 60 days might be a while to wait.
Based on having to adjust the communication strategy?
Well, no, just to see where we're going to go after it. I just figured if we waited until that discussion before we had this vote. But
So you think
I'm
that
either way.
discussion will inform the order, the priority of the topics?
Not the priority of the topics, but whether or not we have a meeting in June.
Madam Chairman,
And that there may be, excuse me, go ahead. And that there may be actions that we take today that would require follow-up. And that might need it to be done in 30 days instead of 60 days.
Madam Chairman,
John?
that's my motion that's sitting there under old business, and it was worded in such a way that we merely are recommending that this communications plan be used by the county staff, and that Mr. Toronto be nominated and enfranchised by this body to work directly with her to carry the communications plan forward. We don't have a communications plan. The county has a communications plan. I love the skeleton here. I love the skeleton that's been carried forward with the update we have. I don't think that this bears on that. If there's something comes along out of the discussion today that would cause an adjustment in the communications plan, and if the motion that's under old business actually passes, it's Virginia and Vinnie that are figuring out what to do with the plan. It doesn't come back to us to again deal with it. That's my view anyway.
Yes, Courtney?
I would just recommend that we all be very cognizant of how much work it takes the county staff to put one of these meetings on. And if we, require a meeting for something pretty small and something that could probably easily wait for another month, we're basically slowing their progress on the projects down, which is not good for our overall goals, So I would move forward with allowing them to have, a month. I mean, when we originally envisioned this, when we were going through the tax, that this committee would meet quarterly, and here we are meeting monthly. So, we might want to get down to that quarterly time frame at some point, because the amount of effort and time it takes for them to just mobilize all the people that are going to be speaking to us. I mean, it's important that we do it, but how regularly, is really up to us, and I think it does impact their ability to do the projects we're all supposed to be doing right now, so.
Okay, Charles?
Yeah, and I would pretty much echo what Courtney's saying about give the county staff the time to get their staff on board. And I think the topics that we're going to learn about, whether seagrass or denitrification, they're very important for us to understand that more. But, the nature of science, science, as you get more information, it changes. So it's going to be a constant learning cycle for us. So, yeah, let's get as much in as we can before, we go to the next round of projects. But I agree. I think June's, at least June's a good time to take a month off.
Okay, well, let's call the vote. We have a two-part motion on the floor. First part, we are going to...
Madam Chairman, it's a single motion. We're voting on the whole thing.
Okay. Single motion to not have the meeting in June, and Virginia and I will work together to prioritize the information education meetings we have going forward, and we have taken note of the need to prioritize the monitoring performance as one of those. Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Say aye. Aye. All those opposed? And the motion passes. And we move to the...
Could we have
Yes.
some discussion on Virginia's presentation?
Yes, let's have some discussion.
I've got two items. One, I think this project list is awesome, and I would ask that you bring it forward as part of our agenda package each time with a note on the date of the last change to it. This is the best rack-up I've seen of where we stand on this. The second thing, you mentioned the rock, I assume it's breeze swept, are moving forward with measurement. I wonder if we could treat that as a pilot element, and then at that point, where we figure out how it is, if the intellectual property is something that we could apply to other similar projects, that we give very serious thought to making that a universal metric based on learning experience, rather than asking each outfit to figure it out on their own.
Okay, good suggestion.
Virginia, do we have any kind of a financial update this month? We should have received.
You have a report, I
Yes.
think.
Okay, because I didn't see it in my package, I'm sorry.
It should be the 2 pages back from the staff report.
Yeah, it's on the last page.
So we've received, sorry, I should have
It's
said
okay.
something. So we've received 2 of the monthly distribution checks, and so the total in the bank is a little over 6 million now. So those checks are rolling in on schedule and
we should-
slightly above the conservative projected amount. So,
Virginia, we should have 3 in, January, February, and March, because we're in May.
They are 2 months behind. So we received the January money at the end of March, and we received the February money at the end of April.
Right.
And we
Okay.
should receive the March money at the end of May.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, great. I'm glad somebody's watching that. Okay, Vinnie, this is, oh, okay, go ahead.
The thing on the rockledge monitoring is, you've still got your consultant on board to provide additional interpretation of that? Is that, or is there someone from an engineering perspective that can do more than just take a look at the reduction? Because my only concern is groundwater movement, all of those things, they can take quite a while. And so being cautious about how we interpret that data to make sure that we really know what it means is really important, because it could send misinformation, either probably not as much positive, that it's overperforming, but there's a chance if we're not seeing results, that may or may not be truly reflective of the long-term success of those. So I would caution, just be careful of that, because groundwater can be very slow to react, and make sure that we've got.
And very challenging. It doesn't necessarily move in a nice, smooth
That's
path.
right.
It
So
finds a fissure and it moves quickly. So Claudia Listapad is the lead PI on that work. She is a consultant to both the city and the county. The city negotiated what they wanted to know for this project, and then the 3 entities worked together on what additional information we would want to know. We more than doubled what was being collected there. Claudia Listapad is also a partner with Leesa Souto on 2 other groundwater efforts, one through Florida Tech and the legislative funds, and a separate one that is legislative funds through the county. All of these there's an incredible scarcity of groundwater nutrient concentration data and even groundwater elevation data. And so all of the modeling that's been done to estimate the impact of septic tanks in the county and to estimate the loading impact of groundwater on the lagoon, they're using a very sparse number of actual data points. And so all of these collection efforts are to try to not just answer questions about those specific project areas, but inform and calibrate and validate these models that are being used. You know, they're statewide models, but they're being used in Brevard. And so there will be many benefits to this data collection.
Yeah, and I'm completely supportive of the data, just it can be challenging,
Yes.
as you're well aware.
Yes,
I had a
John?
request from someone that maybe next year when we have a project list like this one, that as the projects come in and are assigned a number, that those numbers don't change to make a nice, neat list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It'd be easier to follow the projects through with the same numbering system all the way through. That was from,
Right, and so the reason these numbers are out of order is because I haven't changed them.
right, but there were changes earlier this year in the projects we reviewed.
Right.
And those numbers, and then as we got to the list being generated, and so it's all the way from the time the project comes in to the time we're tracking it through, that it be given a unique number that we can follow through.
Okay.
Thanks.
Any other discussion? Okay, let's move on to our communication strategy update. We had to postpone this, but I've been eager to hear what the comments are that came in, and if you could overview. Vinny?
Yes, thank you. First thing, did everyone get a chance to do a Facebook update today that they're having their meeting? If not, I'm ready for my photo. If anyone wants to take one of me and post it again. Well, you gotta do it every month, John. That's the point, letting everybody know. So getting to the communications strategy, I thank you for all the feedback and questions that I got. There were some very good ones and brought out some good points. Starting from the top, there was a question that asked whether this was in the bylaws of the COC or outside our duties. And I think, as John mentioned in our previous discussion here, this is a communication strategy that we are recommending that the county does. It's not one that this board is going to do. And the components of it, the points that it's attempting to communicate, one, either fall under monitoring, in my opinion, and two, would actually help get better applications and get better information to the public, resulting in better applications. I know some of you may have read the Florida Today article about aeration in the Indian River Lagoon, and one of the brilliant parts of this plan is that it's a 10-year plan, but it also accepts changes along the way. So I think that might have been a point where the communication was not as strong as it could have, and letting that person know that instead of writing an article, which is great, they could submit a project, which is even better. So I think that is part of one of the goals that we're attempting to address when we look at the applications coming in. I know there's a workshop set up for applications, but in the communication strategy, there's actually a video and other materials that can be watched at any time if somebody can't make that communication or that training session. So again, my opinion and the way it was written was that this is something that the county will do that will either fall under monitoring or will fall into the application process, which is just going to benefit the applications. The other thing is there were questions about how much time will this take, and there was a concept that came about in websites and web development where you separate the data from the presentation, and that's kind of how I view what's being done here. So in other words, the county, and in attachment B in the contract that everybody saw and we just looked at, there's information that's going to be collected. Well, the county could format it to present it for us to see in case we wanted to see it, but it could also be presented or formatted so that the residents of Brevard County could see it. So what you do is you collect the data once, and then you just figure out how it should be displayed multiple times, or as many times as you want. So the data that will be collected for these updates will be put into the website for everybody to watch or look at, including us. So I don't think, as far as the monitoring component is, there's going to be that much additional time because that data is going to be collected anyways. Some of the other questions were who will maintain the proposed website, and it's a county website as I see it, and as Virginia and I have talked, so it will be part of the county. There will be, I don't want to say an expense necessarily, but there will be a project to create the map that has all the projects on it. I think the Department, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, DEP, they've got a website that has that, and there's a chance maybe we could borrow their data. So there may be a cost involved in that, but that again to me falls under monitoring, which we have budgeted $1 million a year, correct, Virginia? And I don't think creating just that map component is going to be a significant chunk in that. So that was one of the questions that was asked. I think that was a majority of the points that were asked. If anybody had any additional.
A point of clarification, you mentioned monitoring several times, and when I was reading monitoring and the strategy, I was thinking you were talking about the water quality monitoring in the Indian River Lagoon, not the monitoring of progress of projects. And so when you're talking about monitoring here in this recommendation, are you talking about monitoring the progress of projects?
I had thought the monitoring was going to be the projects, no?
Projects, yes.
That's not the way it reads in the.
Lagoon,
in-
no. Projects, yes.
You know, when you go to DEP and use them as an example for monitoring, you think about the water quality monitoring stations throughout the Indian River Lagoon. And so one of the comments I made when it was about trying to do this is, it's been a massive effort for the agencies just to get something up with real-time data, much less spending any time looking at the data.
I'm more in line with you. When I thought we were going to spend $1 million a year on monitoring, I think that means water quality or follow-up to a project when the water outflows from a dredge, for example. Though I understand kind of an expansion of that term, which is what you've done, Vinny, and I'm not objecting, because I listened to what you were saying, and I don't think we're talking about a lot of money. And I think it is important that we and the general public can monitor, for lack of a better word, the status of projects when they get started, when they announce they're started, when they physically get started, when stuff is completed. I think that's important, that the community knows that a project's been completed, and the other part, more important, is that it was successful or was not. So, but I don't want to spend a lot of money on this.
No, and again, the whole point of this was to use the time that's already going to be used and just make sure that it can be reached a larger audience. And that attachment B that we looked at, that has so much information that as the project holders or handlers are filling that information out, we could actually create a form online that information, once they fill it out online, automatically gets approved with the click of a button, and then boom, that information is publicly available. So it does not need to be entered again. But I do think that the monitoring was set for the project, right, Virginia?
So there are a couple things. One is monitoring the project status, as you described, and showing that progress to the public. Then, for a select subset of those projects, like Rockledge, we will be collecting water quality information specific to that project. Does it deliver the water quality improvement benefits that we expect? Or are there changes that need to be made to make it more effective? What we don't have the funds to do, which is I think Dr. Windsor's point, is water quality monitoring in the lagoon, and the state-funded stations and Harbor Branch stations that are out there, and the monthly sampling that is done. That's probably over $1 million by those agencies to collect that information, and there's no intent to duplicate that effort.
And that data currently exists. There's no reason for us to duplicate it, though we should be collecting it, because that is a baseline, is what's happened in every, May 19th. For the last 15 years, we have data at stations.
Right, and one of the comments was to put links on our website to where those other agencies are posting that information so people can find it. One of the challenges of that water quality information is that the system is so incredibly dynamic. And so trends, what we're looking for is trends in a very, very noisy data set. And it takes years and years of data to be able to see those trends, and it takes, to the casual observer, it's not immediately obvious. So those real-time stations that are out there putting that data online available to everybody, it hasn't been quality controlled, and it hasn't been analyzed. Nobody's made sense. Nobody's said, what is the story that this data is telling us? And that's a challenge that I'm not sure. I don't think we're the ones to take that on.
John?
I've got two questions that are going to bear on how I vote on this guy's motion, and perhaps the rest of you. The first is the motion volunteers Vinnie's contribution, and it volunteers you accepting it. Are the two of you comfortable with working together to carry this plan forward? That's question one. Question two,
I'd follow Virginia anywhere.
and question two is to you, Virginia. Is this a good thing from your perspective? Will you be comfortable and receptive to us telling you how to suck eggs in the communications area?
Well, I think this has been really helpful to me to sort of identify these three target audiences, objectives, purposes, because it's not, the way I would have approached it. So I find it very helpful to have 14 other minds representing a lot of diverse interests in the county, informing this. And then we will take it and do what we can with the resources that we have.
Could I suggest, if this motion passes, that perhaps periodically, quarterly, or semi-annually, that you come forward with the current communication plan as it has evolved forward, so we can maintain visibility?
Could we ask Vinnie to do that?
You can ask me.
It's their plan. If this motion
Yeah.
passes, it is the county's communications plan.
And as the motion says, I will work with them, but I still think, as John said, Virginia presenting it would be.
Understand.
Where I
You'll
would
do it.
pause is just that, someone has to do the work.
Yeah.
So, someone has to have that responsibility, and so it's just important to make sure there is a person or people who are going to be doing that, so it doesn't get lost. I also had another couple of comments on the plan, and maybe it's more into the detail, but you had suggested like a thermometer or some way of measuring how successful we were, and my concern was that you mentioned we should have the how many pounds of nutrients were removed kind of at the top. And I really think it should be a long progress. It's really, because this is the long road we're going to be on. And, in year one, we're going to have so much removed, in year two. But I want to make sure the public understands that this is a process that's going to take many years, because it took so many years to get us in this situation. So I wouldn't want to mislead them by thinking, oh yeah, look at all the nutrients were removed this year, we must be done. No, they need to understand we've got a lot of work to do, and it may be beyond the 10 years that the tax is going to be in effect.
Well, that's why, with the thermometer idea, and it's just like any fundraiser, they always put the goal at the top. So if our goal, I don't remember how many tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds of nitrogen we have removed, but if they see we've only removed 20,000, they see there's a long way to go. And I'm sure on every fundraiser, the secrets to those thermometers is you always go over the top, because that kind of encourages everybody and says, oh, we did so much better than we planned. And beyond the magic behind the magic thermometer, I think we are going to be going over the top already. So I don't think we would need to do that. But I agree, Charles, like having it. That's why I also had, I think, and this is what we were calling the dashboard, which is just kind of a way to briefly look at the stats of the project. There was going to be close to that thermometer was going to be the time involved. So you could see again that not only have we only removed this amount, but we have this much longer to go. Because that is one of the hardest parts that I struggled, and I know some of the people that I sent this communication strategy out with, is how do we show the history, like how long it's taken to get the lagoon where it is now, as opposed to how long, this is only a 10-year plan, but we've been abusing the lagoon for, 50 years? So the question is how would we show that? And one of the things that I really try to focus on, again, the plan is to focus on the facts and what we're doing and what this project plan is doing, which is promising to remove nitrogen and phosphorus. So I was trying to stay away from some of those numbers that we may not be directly in touch with. But I agree on your point that making sure that people realize that this is a long-term goal and plan.
Okay, well, we have a motion under old business. Can we move that up and complete this conversation? Do I
You're
need
the chair.
So we can go ahead and take the motion that was moved by John and seconded was a communication strategy, let's see, that we endorse the communications plan as presented and recommend that it is used by county staff, and that Mr. Toronto be nominated to represent the COC with county staff in helping maintain the plan. Any more discussion on that?
Yes.
Yes.
Strategy or plan?
Good question. I
I mean,
think
this
strategy.
is labeled a strategy, and so I'm taking this as sort of a guidance document for Virginia
Yeah.
and not, we are imposing something on her, even though the word suggestion's been used many times. I can imagine in a year or two from now, somebody looking at this list and saying, well, Virginia, you didn't do this, and you didn't do this, and you didn't do this, you should be fired. And it'll happen if we let it. And so please, make it clear in the minutes, make it clear here, this is not a plan.
Okay.
This is a strategy.
As a
Strategy.
card-carrying planner and a card-carrying strategist both, I think that's a distinction without a difference.
Well, then we need to change the name.
Well, it is called
No,
the communication
Strategy
strategy.
is a plan.
Then we need to change the name. I'm not going to vote for this.
And what would do you
It could be called a
suggest?
guidance document, suggestions from the committee.
I think guidance document is a great alternative. I loved hearing that.
Make a motion to amend the main motion to say guidance document instead of plan.
John, what is your opinion of it? Do you still
I
think
think
it's a distinction without
without a difference, but if it's going to clutter up two votes,
Yeah,
I just
let's
made a
go ahead
motion
and get it passed.
to amend the main motion to substitute the word guidance document where it says plan.
Okay, do we have a second? All those in favor?
Aye.
Say aye. Opposed? Okay, now we can go back to the motion that was actually on the floor, right? Any more discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion passes. We move to item B in our presentations on living shorelines. So my understanding is that each speaker will have 10 minutes.
Right, and so they're going to come up here, and
And we will take just a couple of clarifying questions after each of those, but the primary discussion, questions from the audience will be after the panel discussion or during the panel discussion.
so while she gets this open, I want to just thank all of them for carving out time in their day. There are obviously a number of groups working on this, and there are regular and irregular conversations. I'll let each of them introduce themselves, so I'm not interjecting all the time, but thank you for being here.
Sure,
Annie.
thanks, Virginia. I'm Annie Roddenberry. I'm with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission's Aquatic Habitat Conservation and Restoration Group. I want to acknowledge my co-presenter, Jeff Beal. He works quite a bit in this region. Many of you might know him. We do similar work along the Atlantic coast here. So part of what we do in the Aquatic Habitat Conservation and Restoration Group is to promote, plan, and implement living shorelines around the state of Florida. So we're very appreciative that you all have identified this as a topic that the committee wants to hear more about and understand a little bit better. So I'd like to kind of start the series of presentations by just laying out what do we mean when we talk about living shorelines and what's FWC's role in the process. I really like this graphic from SAGE in 2015 that shows bank stabilizations along this spectrum of green, which would be just natural vegetation, only plants, and then all the way to the other side of a gray bank stabilization technique, which is your concrete vertical structures like a seawall or a bulkhead. But there's a lot of room in between to combine these techniques depending on what you need to stabilize that shoreline. So we want people to understand they're not mutually exclusive. You can have, a variety of techniques that fall within this green to gray range. But with living shorelines, we really want to push people more towards this green side because by having those natural components along your shoreline, you get a lot more ecosystem benefits than you would by just having that vertical gray structure. So some of these benefits are things like increased habitat. So you really create that nice transition from the water to the land that so many of our organisms need for foraging and nesting. You maintain a lot of those coastal processes like water filtration, basic primary production, and you allow that shoreline to naturally adapt to the impacts that we're seeing of climate change. So you give that shoreline space to move and change as we start to see sea level rise, increase frequency and intensity of storms, and the research has shown that they do. They will grow and change as the conditions shift. So lots of options for living shorelines as far as layout and components. So again, sort of in the most simplistic sense, in the top left, you have just plants along a gentle slope down to oysters, and then sort of increasing in complexity down to the bottom right. You may have a seawall, which we think of as more towards that gray side, but you can add plants and oysters to add that living part of the shoreline, and it provides a lot of that habitat and those natural processes. So where you end up on the scale is going to really depend on your energy regime and kind of what you need along the shoreline. So some of the things we take into consideration: what's the wind and wave energy at the site? Do we need a breakwater to slow down that energy before it hits the shoreline? And what are the plants that would naturally be found in that area, both by elevation and by climate zone? So just a couple pictures of examples. We've got everything from just your nice grassy shoreline, if you still want to maintain that coastal view, to down on the bottom there. You have a bit more privacy for homeowners who might be on a busy waterfront. But again, both of those, or all three of those, would be considered living shorelines. So what's our role in this process? We have a group of biologists around the state who have specialties in various habitats and species, and we have experience through the whole process of living shorelines, from planning, designing, finding funding, and implementation. We are a commenting agency, so we often provide technical guidance through commenting on state and federal permits. We have some internal funding for living shorelines projects through things like our state wildlife grants program, and we also work very frequently with partners, as many of my colleagues on the panel can attest to put grants together for external funding to implement these programs. Outreach and education is always a huge part of what we do. We need that public support for people to understand why we're doing this and why it's important to have these living shorelines. FWC also has a leadership role in two working groups along this coast: the Northeast Estuarine Restoration Team and the East Central Estuarine Restoration Team, the NERT and the ESERT, as we lovingly call them. And these are just sort of open think tanks of restoration practitioners around the state, from state agencies, federal groups, nonprofits, universities, the private sector, and this is just a smattering of some of the partners. I wouldn't possibly be able to fit everybody's logo on here and still keep it legible. It's a really amazing working group, and we can help spend taxpayer dollars more efficiently by meeting several times a year, sharing our successes and failures, tackling projects on a more regional scale. So it's been really helpful to move forward some of these techniques for living shorelines over the past few years. So I just want to share a project with you that is in Volusia County at our Mosquito Lagoon Marine Enhancement Center. We created a 5-acre salt marsh, which you can see in the bottom right hand of the picture. And in this red circled area, we have what we call our Living Shorelines Demonstration Area. So this is a place where people can come and physically explore and see what do different variations of a living shoreline look like. It really is going to help them see, okay, what could this look like on my property, whether I'm a private homeowner or a public land manager. You know, how could this layout take place on the lands that I manage? So we have everything from a retaining wall on the left. We've got an amended seawall there in the middle where maybe you already have a hard structure, but you can add some of these components to break up that wave energy and provide habitat. And then riprap on the right. There are a couple of other components there that aren't pictured, but it's a great place for people to physically explore. And there are more living shoreline demo areas coming soon, which I think you'll hear about in a little bit from Jake. We have great signage there to show people what exactly are you looking at, give them sort of a relative cost estimate, and something we're really proud of that we've been working with a lot of our partners on is this website, floridalivingshorelines.com. If you haven't visited it, I encourage you to please explore. We wanted to provide a resource for private homeowners to understand what's the process, what are the steps I need to go through, and where can I find help. So we know that working on public lands, it's not going to completely get the job done. We need help from citizens and homeowners to help implement shorelines on private properties as well. So we want to give them regional contacts, examples that they can visit, plant lists that are appropriate in their region, and people they can call to walk them through the permitting process, that type of thing. So please feel free to explore that. Really quickly, I want to share a project that's shaping up right now, Riverview Park in the city of Melbourne. As I understand, the city had a plan to revitalize the park that included a seawall, so several partners approached them and said, hey, we'd like to encourage a living shoreline instead. They were very open to the idea. So as you can see along the shoreline, here's just a snapshot of a few areas experiencing erosion. And some of the erosion's from the water side, the wind and wave action, and some of it's from the top, where we've got stormwater runoff kind of digging out the shoreline. So we have a lot of vegetation there, but it could use a little TLC. We can arrange these components in a better way. So our FWC staff applied for some in-house funding last fall, and this project was not funded, but there's an application going in today to try again through the National Ice Stream Program. Among a number of partners, Brevard Zoo has really taken the lead at this point to get this work done. So we're looking at a breakwater of coquina and oysters. We want natural materials and then native plants along the shoreline to help really stabilize that bank. So this is a project that shows the importance of taking a phased approach to a lot of these, which I think you all understand very well, that sometimes you just have to take small steps and it's going to take a little while. So first step is just getting the breakwater in place and then the native plants. And then maybe for phase 2, we can approach that upland area a little bit better. And then in phase 3, it might be something like addressing the swale that drains a nearby neighborhood and runs down this ditch into the lagoon. Well, we might be able to do something like create more of a shallow meandering creek. It's better habitat for juvenile fish and wildlife, gives more surface area for filtration, and then maybe a boardwalk where people can view this and learn about what we've done. So just an example of some of the different components we can put in for a comprehensive project. So I wanted to, again, just make sure that everybody was aware of that great resource, FloridaLivingShorelines.com, and then share my contact information and my colleague Jeff's, and then I'll let the rest of my panel take it from here.
Do we have any clarifying questions? Okay. Okay, great, thank you. Yes,
Permitting involved with that?
you need to be at the mic so that our television audience can hear you as well.
Just a question, were the permits involved with that, and if so, the challenges involved with obtaining those permits?
Yep, sorry.
Are you specifically talking about the Riverview Park project, or just any of the Living Shoreline projects?
In the living shoreline.
Yeah. So one of the successes that we see of those working groups like the NERT is we have a lot of the permitting agencies represented there, and we've been able to work together and say we need to make living shorelines an easier process for people. So just this past year, they've implemented a nationwide living shorelines permit, which certain activities like using mostly natural material, working within a certain distance of the shoreline, doing this stabilization that's been proven to work, is all covered under this nationwide permit that moves a little bit more smoothly. The permitting folks know that these techniques work.
With agencies specifically?
That's through the Army Corps of Engineers.
Okay.
And that's nationwide 54. Water Management District, yes, permits and DEP.
Okay, thank you. And so we'll go forward, we'll take a couple clarifying questions from the committee after each presentation, just to manage time better. And then when we get to the panel discussion, we'll ask for questions from the audience and open it up more so we don't lose a lot of time going back and forth from the mic.
Good morning. Thank you for having me back again. My name is Leesa Souto. I'm the Executive Director of Marine Resources Council. I'm here to talk about habitat restoration, but before I get started on that, I wanted to address some concerns that came up at the last meeting. presentations that were given by members of different groups that came and talked about our education programs were misinterpreted, it seems, by some who thought that we don't work together. So I want to present a few slides real quick to talk about some of the things that we have done to work together before I start talking about the restoration work that we're doing at MRC. Rest assured, we're working together. One of the things that MRC has been doing for 30 years, which some of you may not know about because you're relatively new to the Lagoon cause, are the American Assemblies. They were developed by President Eisenhower when he was president of Columbia University, and he used them in the political arena when he was president of the United States. It puts together delegates that represent diverse stakeholder groups and asks them to focus on a specific issue. MRC's done we're about to do the 16th one of those in August 17 and 18, the Communications Assembly, where we will again put together 100 delegates to come together to find out how can we better communicate as a 5-county Lagoon community. The first one was done in 1984. That American Assembly is what launched the Indian River Lagoon Act, brought our National Estuary Program here, started the Indian River Lagoon Scenic Byway, started the conservation lands programs, started the advocacy groups that are eventually the ones that came together to pass the Save Our Lagoon tax, which is how you all came to be a committee. So I just wanted to reassure you that we are working together, we will continue to work together, and we're doing it as a 5-county lagoon community. We're out there, we're the ones holding the signs, getting people involved. We're the ones cleaning up the fish when the fish kill happened. And we're the ones pictured on the bridge of the cover of your plan. So the Hands Across the Lagoon event was done in 1985, and it was also done in 2013. And in 2013, we had at least a dozen nonprofit organizations, one on each of 8 different causeways, lagoon-wide, leading thousands, over 5,000 people, holding hands across the lagoon. We do clean water summits in Tallahassee almost every year for the past 4 years. And, of course, we work together on the Save Our Lagoon referendum. So that is my little reassurance that we are working together. So I don't want you to feel like we're not. I'm going to talk about 2 things. MRC's role in shoreline restoration has really been reduced. Right now we don't have a shoreline restoration person on staff. We are looking to hire one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 main areas. One is that we do have a lot of mangroves. We've been growing mangroves for a long time. We have thousands of them. And the other one is I'm going to try to continue the conversation about doing a more strategic plan for shoreline restoration in the lagoon. So mangroves are super plants. I'm glad that Annie talked about living shorelines so I could kind of cover just mangroves and what a great species they are. They're not really a species. They are a group of species that are salt-tolerant tropical trees or shrubs. They do provide a lot of habitat. They protect shorelines. Not only do they protect it, they actually build shorelines, and they filter nutrients, which is important to this committee, and they sequester carbon, which is important for the world. There are 3 main types that we see. They're the red, blacks, and whites. The reds grow closest to the water. The blacks kind of grow in the intertidal area, and then the whites are more the upland ones. We have the white mangroves and the buttonwoods. The reds are the ones that have those prop roots that stick out that you see that are kind of the quintessential mangrove design. The blacks are the ones that are they're salt tolerant, and they have the prop roots that come up through like fingers in the soil. They're really cool. They're really interesting species. They do provide a lot of habitat. Reminding the committee, we have 685 fish species in our lagoon. Really awesome. A lot of them depend on the mangrove propagules and the mangrove shorelines to have it's a place where their nurseries can have some protection. The 370 bird species use them for bird rookeries. They also, when I mentioned, they build shorelines. So they not only protect shorelines, but they actually accumulate sediment, and they build the shoreline also. And they have been called, the reds in particular, the walking tree, so that potentially as sea level rises and the lagoon waters start to rise, they can migrate upland. It's going to be an interesting phenomenon to see. They're already migrating north. And that they absorb wave energy. So when Annie talked about living shorelines and they're really contingent on energy, she was talking about the amount of wave energy and the type of what you would expect to see in terms of wave energy hitting the shore. So mangroves are really good at mitigating that wave energy. And they are known to protect and prevent hurricane damage. No man-made shoreline has ever survived a Category 4 hurricane. This is actually the Lagoon House shoreline after the storms in 2004. And you notice the mangroves were there and the shoreline is gone. So the mangroves stayed, the shoreline disappeared, and it was a hardened shoreline. And all that did was lose their leaves. And there are examples in Indonesia and in Bangladesh of where thousands of lives were saved when the mangroves were able to dissipate the wave energy as it was approaching the shoreline. So MRC has done a lot of habitat restoration in our lives, in our 30 years as an organization. This is at Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge. We installed 8,500 linear feet of shoreline, engaged hundreds of volunteers, planted 4,000 red mangroves, and put down 11,000 spartina grasses. Port Canaveral, working with partners, installed 1,500 linear feet of shoreline, engaged volunteers again, planted 1,000 mangroves, and put in 3,000 spartina grasses. Jupiter Island Greenway, it's a property that we wrote a grant, so we manage that 42 acres down in Jupiter Island. We have trails there. We engage volunteers in installation of the trails at educational kiosks. We had to remove some of the largest Brazilian pepper I've ever seen in my life, and we planted about 2,000 mangroves there. It's an ongoing management effort. And then one of the important features and resources that we have available to you all is we have greenhouses full of mangroves down at our Sebastian River Greenway. Some of them, most of them, in fact, are more than 4 years old. So we have established mangroves that are, really getting to height down there that need to get in the lagoon. So we have about 8,000 mangroves currently. Most of those are more than 4 years old. So they're starting to establish secondary prop roots. And they range in height, and we have reds, whites, and blacks, mostly reds, but we started adding the whites and blacks more recently. The other point I'd like to make today is that we really need a plan as we move forward with oyster restoration and shoreline habitat restoration. And there are examples. The one I'm presenting is the Charlotte Harbor National Estuary Programs Plan. Our friend and colleague Ann Birch here from the Nature Conservancy is working over in Charlotte Harbor now. She is willing to let us use, the Nature Conservancy is letting us use their model. All we would have to do is work as a community to figure out which variables to put in it and run it. So it would be less expensive than trying to recreate our own model. I don't know if anybody's already thinking about doing this. I'm sure it's been discussed. I'm sure that this kind of idea has been discussed, but it can guide management. It can prioritize where oysters should be restored first. It can evaluate restoration techniques. It can define success criteria, and it facilitates permitting. So when you have a plan, it's a lot easier to go to your permitting agencies and say, it's in the plan, we've done all the research. It makes sense to do it like this. And more importantly, it's going to restore oysters in the areas where they're most likely to survive. Instead of just putting them everywhere and trying to decide later, they died, I wonder why. Have the science in advance that you can take out in the field and then test the model, see if it's going to work or not. Their data, very few really GIS data that they put in their model. Aquaculture lease areas, bathymetry, seagrass persistence, seagrass coverage, boat channels, and shoreline data were the ones selected out of dozens. The entire plan is available online, or I can send it to you. We would have to, like I said, this is something that, the scientists that you all, the people, the managers who are doing it would have to reach consensus on what are the appropriate layers to include in the plan that we would run here. The beautiful thing is you come out with a map that looks like this. It says this area right here is 100% suitable for oyster restoration. This area is 80%, 50%, 20%, 10% not suitable at all. So you come out with a map that tells you where you should be targeting and what the suitability prediction is that you can then prove when you put your projects in the ground and say, the plan was right, the model was right. So the other thing I would encourage is that there are a lot of different methods. I know a lot of them are being implemented in the lagoon. Again, in the plan we could start like everybody's monitoring their method, which ones are really working in which conditions, where, when, and how. And that's all I got. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you inviting me back. And I'll be happy to take a question from the committee.
Yes, John.
I think.
I have two. The first one's specific to you, and the second might have to go over to Virginia. Where we are aware of invasive species that are impacting natural mangroves, who would somebody contact to have those invasive species removed?
There's probably consultants at this point. I mean, it depends on which land it's on. So on public lands, on conservation lands, MRC or KBB might be interested in coming out and looking at it.
Okay.
Brazilian pepper removal is not a fun job.
No, I know. And not just Brazilian peppers. There's other stuff
Yeah.
that's,
On private land, it would be, you'd have to go to a landscaping company.
okay. And then the second, the suitability map, and this may come in later when Brevard Zoo talks, we're supposed to put in .86 miles in 3 different locations next year. Okay, $1 million. Have we got site locations yet?
You're going to hear a whole lot about
Okay,
site
I'll wait,
suitability.
I'll wait.
So I appreciate Leesa setting you up for the importance of that, and I believe you'll get saturated, so.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we have Jake, Brevard Zoo.
Which one is yours? Sorry, I didn't know. You're fine. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jake Zehnder, and I'm here on behalf of Brevard Zoo's Restore Our Shores program to talk about community-based restoration here in the Indian River Lagoon. So, Brevard Zoo has a decade of lagoon education, outreach, and restoration experience. We began this journey with a program that was started in 2007 in Mosquito Lagoon, spearheaded by researchers from UCF like Dr. Melinda Donnelly and Dr. Linda Walters. This was a program with UCF and the Nature Conservancy to restore damaged oyster reefs up in Mosquito Lagoon in Canaveral National Seashore. We joined that project in 2009 and helped engage over 45,000 local residents in direct lagoon conservation by creating and deploying oyster mats to fix the problems they were having in Mosquito Lagoon. The original goals of that project were met in 2016. Oyster gardening was a project that was started in 2014 when the zoo was approached by Brevard County's Board of Commissioners with a $150,000 grant to spearhead a project to get our local residents involved in oyster restoration here in Brevard County. This was funding from the county and St. John's River Water Management District in a cost-share program in the state of Florida. And going back to John's question, this allowed us to reach out from the very northern tip of the county to the very southern tip of the county and start getting that data that we need to know where the oysters are, where they survive. So we do monitor the survivability and recruitment of oysters throughout the entire county. I do want to highlight each of those little green pins is an individual lagoon front resident who has oysters sometime in this project so far collecting data. So we know where the oysters are, where we're getting natural recruitment, wild oysters breeding in the area local to that resident, and also where the oysters survive. The good news is generally they survive everywhere. There just may not be a wild oyster population left nearby. So we did enlist an army of lagoon front residents that we've turned into citizen scientists for this project, holding more than 50 workshops. And the 2017 workshops, more than 2 months in advance, are already full. So this is over 1,000 oyster gardeners helping us since this program launched. It is a great project. Residents come and attend a short workshop where they learn about the threats that the Indian River Lagoon is facing right now, kind of how we got to this point, and what they can do to take action as an individual citizen and participate. They get trained on how to care and raise their little baby oysters, their oyster spat, and also what to look for in the habitats where the oysters are growing. We have both friendly organisms that will come into the habitat, like our little seahorse there, and also organisms that will prey on the oysters that we want to keep out. And after 6 to 9 months, typically, they'll return the oysters to us as we go out into the Indian River Lagoon and build a reef to restore those oysters to their native habitat. Again, we do monitor these reefs. We'll collect the data from the oysters once they're returned by our oyster gardeners so we can track survival and recruitment of new individuals to the reef over time. And so far, this project has built 8 reefs to date, with another pending permits and 5 more reefs scheduled for 2017. The methodologies we use here in Brevard County are a little different than other areas, partly due to permitting restrictions and partly due to what works here in Brevard County. So primarily that is shell bags, which are filled with the live oysters that our gardeners have been growing in blank shell. We've also taken the oyster mats that were so successful up in Mosquito Lagoon and adapted them for purposes here in Brevard County, where the problem is different. And shoreline vegetation, like Dr. Leesa was mentioning, with vegetation, mangroves, marsh grasses. These are native plants that are already found along our shorelines. And this program has already added more than 215,000 native oysters back to the lagoon. Again, continuous monitoring for survival and recruitment. That was initially launched with Brevard Zoo and researchers from UCF, and currently is being done in newer projects with Brevard Zoo and the Natural Resources Management Department here at Brevard County. Brevard Zoo's Restore Our Shores program is expanding our efforts into living shoreline restoration. We have funding from the National Estuary Program, the IRL NEP, to continue the oyster mat making project, which has now been running for about a decade. This is part of the DNA of Brevard County. If you talk to people about oyster restoration, they almost all have heard about oyster mats, or their kids made one in school, or they've made one out in the community. We've also taken on a program to pot and care for mangroves. Mangroves are incredibly important here in Brevard County. This is an off-branch of the Adopt a Mangrove program that DEP was already running in partnership with the zoo. And community outreach is kind of our bread and butter, doing hundreds of presentations to the public to educate them on the problems of the lagoon, public workshops, school groups, community groups, etc. And outside of the time of year in summer when we're actually building our reefs, we're holding 12 to 16 workshops just on mats and mangroves each month. So as Annie alluded to, we do have a living shoreline demonstration site coming here to Brevard County. This is part of a $500,000 grant that the zoo received with partners like the county and FIT from Florida's Department of Economic Opportunity to expand a oyster shell recycling initiative. Oyster shells are the very raw material that we need to do any oyster restoration work. To experiment on appropriate methodologies that are specific to Brevard County and that will work here. I don't want to steal Dr. Robert Weaver's thunder, so I won't talk too much more about that since he's going to get to it shortly. And then also to construct a demonstration site, and emphasis is demonstration. So lagoon front residents that have shoreline property can see what will work for them. If they have a natural beach, like on the left, coquina boulders and riprap, like in the center, or a hardened structure like a seawall or a bulkhead on the right, we're going to demonstrate what is available to them, what options they have for modifying their existing shoreline to a living shoreline. This site will be located in Indy Atlantic, right where the 192 causeway hits the barrier island. So we'll have 3 different treatments on both town property for Town of Indy Atlantic and Eastminster Presbyterian Church of Indy Atlantic. So we were talking about shell recycling. Again, shell recycling is the very first step in the process of getting the materials we need for oyster restoration. We participate in Shuck and Share, which is a program, I believe, that was started in Volusia County and is managed by one of our partners, the Marine Discovery Center. We get recycled oyster shell, which is the discarded shell from restaurants, shucking houses, and local seafood festivals. In fact, we have a dumpster provided several times a month by Anderson Rentals just to drop off oyster shell. And the county was nice enough to help us with a place far from where people will smell it. As the oyster shells get clean enough for us to use in restoration, it is quite potent. So it's great that we have this partnership where we can stage these shells while they get clean enough that we can use them in our work. And I think it's also worth noting that this is a material that would otherwise be discarded. And in just the last 2 years, we've diverted more than 2.5 million pounds of just oyster shells for restoration work that would otherwise have gone to the landfill. And this supports numerous restoration projects throughout the lagoon and helps foster innovative new partnerships. In particular, we wanted to highlight the Harris Corporation. In 2016, NEP formed a IRL Innovators and Investors Network to kind of harness the human capital and technological expertise that we have here on the Space Coast. And Harris Corporation, very early on in the process, got involved with the zoo to have their engineers volunteer their time to design and build a shell bagging machine. So the shell bagging machine that you see here helps expedite the process of getting the clean oyster shells into the oyster bags that we use in restoration work. And what's next for us? The zoo launched a board member task force to assess the zoo's capacity to increase our involvement in shoreline restoration. And they're in the process of crafting a strategic plan for that. And they've made a commitment that they are willing to invest in the significant staff growth that we need to take on more responsibility in lagoon restoration. The zoo is also in funding discussions to build an exhibit at Brevard Zoo that will have a living shoreline demonstration garden. This will mirror the demonstration site to show the basic principles of living shorelines so that we can reach an even broader audience than just the people who visit the site in the Atlantic, and will help educate residents about the local conservation work happening in the Indian River Lagoon. And I want to stress that no one operates in a vacuum in this industry. We all work together on this. So this is just a small sampling of the various public, private, and nonprofit partners that we have to do this work. And we wanted to thank you guys for letting us be here to talk to you about living shorelines. And we're so excited for what's going to be happening in the lagoon over the next 10 years. So thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? John?
Okay. Thank you,
Yeah.
by the way. And today's Friday. I have to clean my habitats every Friday
Great.
morning.
Great. I appreciate you gardening with us.
I appreciate the opportunity. So we're going to, according to the plan, next year we're going to do 2 or 3 almost 1 mile long oyster reefs. You know, one's in the Banana. So my first question, which I asked earlier, was, has a site been selected for these 3 next year?
So they don't have to be contiguous like that.
Okay.
They can be lots of little sections.
Yes.
And Jane has been working hard on identifying some sites, but you know we're still analyzing, and you're going to hear more from Dr. Donnelly.
The answer is no.
Partially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Partially
Yes.
or no?
Yeah,
Okay.
so Dr. Donnelly will talk a little bit about that.
Okay, I'm going to come
when
back
she
to
comes
that. And I
up.
also want to come some stuff off your site. About how many tons, pounds, numbers of, these are 6 feet wide according to the plan that we approved, okay? And I don't know how deep, and I guess that may depend upon the location, because you obviously don't want them to dry. But about how many shells before we, because on the top we put real oysters.
Yeah,
But on the bottom we use these shells you collect from those of us that eat oysters. How many shells does it take to do 0.84 miles?
That is an excellent question. So that depends, as you mentioned, very much on what physical parameters are at the site, and Dr. Weaver will talk about that a bit. The big problem we have in the lagoon is depth.
Right.
We're not an intertidal system here in Brevard County, so if they're emerged for forever until the water comes back up in wet season. So it's much longer than oysters are able to stay out of the water, so they die. So
we're not going to put them there. We did that experiment
Yeah.
in one location, and they died.
And it
But
doesn't
you
work,
did
yeah.
really successful in other ones.
Correct.
Question is, 6 feet wide by 0.84 miles long, just 1 layer of bags. How many oysters does it take?
So it's about 40 pounds of oysters per bag.
Okay.
If we did our typical design, it's about 78 bags per 20-foot section. So we're talking hundreds and thousands of bags as we multiply up.
70, say it again.
78 bags
70
in a typical design.
Per
We can
20
modify
linear feet.
per 20 linear feet.
So we've been working with a team of University of Florida students on their business school students, and they had to do a capstone project. And we worked with them, the zoo worked with them, the NEP worked with them on this 20-mile endeavor, right? Do we have the dry goods that it will take to do this? And so they did the math using the current design, what would it take? And we are currently, based on the last 2 years of doing shell roundup and shell recycling, we could keep a pace with about 70 to 75% of our needs. So we need to scale that up, and the zoo has been working hard with the shuckery and with the dumpster delivery guys to figure out, how we can get there. So we're not entirely there, but we are well on our way. And all of this is a learning process.
Okay, so then, and scaling up, you understand, I completely support this, okay? I fish,
Yeah.
I understand living shorelines, I understand the environmental benefit, I see the fish there that I don't see against a hard shoreline. I got it, okay?
Yeah.
My questions are very much, my concern is, we're only putting $10 million into this out of a $300+ million budget, but $10 million is a lot of money, and I want to make sure we, this group, all of us, deliver on our promise to the lagoon and to the voters, okay? And everybody I've asked so far, and I've probably asked the wrong people, haven't been able to explain to me how we're going to scale what was essentially a pilot program into a full-scale program. So on your website, it says, to ensure the greatest probability of success, the oyster spat used in the oyster gardening project are spawned from a local brood stock near Sebastian, Florida. And it
Correct.
goes on.
Yeah.
Now, we currently are limited to one hatchery in the entire United States, okay? And as Hurricane Matthew showed us, we have a problem. We didn't have spat, okay? Do we have a backup plan? I've also asked about the cost, and you can go online, anybody can go online, and you can look at what it costs to buy disease-resistant oysters, and I'm pretty sure, and when the oyster lady gets up here, I'm going to ask some genetic questions, okay? But I'm pretty sure the oysters are all pretty much the same in Rappahannock, Virginia, as they are in the Banana River. We're paying a fortune for these things, but it's a pilot program. I understand.
Yeah.
But this is not. The next 10 years is not a pilot program. So I want to start talking about what we're paying for these oysters and why we're limited to one hatchery when there's hatcheries in Tampa and up north in Florida, and
Yeah.
certainly all along the East Coast. How are you going to scale up? What's our backup plan?
I think that's an absolutely valid concern. I do want to just kind of politely push back. The
Sure.
transport of oysters to Brevard County that are not from Brevard County, while they're the same species, presents just unforeseen consequences. Our local oysters have an adaptation to our particular climate and the fact that we're not an intertidal system, that we just don't know what the impacts would be. And I'll let
I guess
a
the other-
researcher comment on
So
that. But
I guess the other question there is there a benefit to having a wider genetic pool so that we're not all, if a disease comes along and the Brevard oysters all get it, we lose everything, where if
Yeah.
you have different genetics in there, and I'm not a scientist, but it certainly seems to me that a variety is a stronger thing in an environment.
yeah, I'll have to let.
We're going to go to her on
Yeah,
that one.
Dr. Donnelly comment on the
Yeah.
pros and cons.
Okay,
of
we'll take one
oysters.
more, and then we're going to move on to our
I
next
was just
speaker.
going to ask, maybe we could hold this discussion on.
Right,
until
it sounds like it would be an
everybody finishes,
appropriate discussion
because
at the
This
end.
is questions that everybody up here could address.
Okay, is that okay, Charles?
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Thank you for your questions, everyone.
Okay. Dr. Robert Weaver.
Robert, I don't know which of these is yours, and I don't want to mess up your video.
Oh, it was fine.
I love the video.
You can't mess them up. They're great. Hi, everyone. Hi. My name is Robert Weaver. I'm a professor at Florida Institute of Technology. I'm also a director of the Indian River Lagoon Research Institute there at Florida Tech. And I was, I'd like to come talk to you about the laboratory study of the Living Shorelines project. Don't let only my name on here fool you. It's a last-minute presentation, but I have a whole army of undergraduates and graduate students working on this, a collaborative project with the zoo and the county as well. When I first got, I'm kind of new to the system here, being that I've only lived in the area for about 6 years now. But over those 6 years, I've gotten very familiar with the lagoon and the system. My expertise is coastal engineering, high-resolution coastal flows, and I've gone off into the area of coastal water quality restoration. I'll I'll hold my other comment until the gentleman gets back. But we have been involved. When I came down here, we started a program at FIT called the Living Dock Program, and where we've started restoration. Restoration projects were ongoing. Again, it's a community thing. I got to know the people that are working with the county and the zoo, and so now we're all working together, and the goal is all the same. The goal is to really restore the natural resiliency of the community out there. I bring kind of the engineering approach to the problem. And as for the project specifically, our purpose was to assess the value of natural revetments and breakwaters for shoreline modification. And so I'm specifically talking about those oyster bags and the groupings of those oyster bags. So what we wanted to do is be able to provide an assessment of the benefits that we get specifically from wave energy reduction when we put these bags out there. And we had to take a few things into consideration: design elevations, water levels, as was mentioned, as Jake mentioned. We don't, especially in the northern Indian River Lagoon, we don't have a very large tidal fluctuation at all. We're very microtidal. Circulation, water elevations are driven by meteorological events and this very regular interannual fluctuation in our sea level due to changes in the coastal ocean circulation. And then also storm waves. That's a very large issue. It's that wave energy that drives coastal erosion. As I tell the students, 90% of all answers to the questions I'm going to ask them is going to be waves, because the waves really are the key drivers. When they break, they mobilize the sediment, and the currents they generate transport that sediment away. So the location, I won't go into that. Jake covered that pretty well. But again, the minimal tidal variation and the design conditions. So here's a sample of some, I call them long-term water levels. They're not that long-term. They're only a couple of years, starting in October of 2014 on the left-hand side, going to September of 2016 on the right-hand side. And these are from some water level gauges that a colleague and I have had out in the lagoon, funded by NOAA. And one thing we notice is we have about a half a meter total variation in water level over the year. But again, this is a long-term fluctuation in water levels. And if when you're designing your reefs, you have to keep this in mind, because these oysters, they can't stay dry for too long. And so you don't want to design a reef too high such that it dries out for extended periods of time. But again, you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck when it comes to wave attenuation by building these things as high as you can. Imagine if you had a solid wall, you're attenuating all of the wave energy, right? So you have to find some happy medium, and this is a design challenge for us. The other one is the storm waves. So we don't have any gauges measuring waves in the lagoon. There have been some very short-term projects to do that, but this is one of the vacancies right now in our data set. So what do? Well, we have numerical models that have been validated for water elevation and circulation, and we take those numerical models and we assume they're going to do pretty good with the waves too, and we run those. And so for this project, I picked 4 of the biggest kind of design events for our region: Francis, Jean, Charlie, and Matthew. And we ran predictions for water level elevation, waves, and the wave characteristics in order to get an idea of what those really high energy design conditions might be for a project like this. So we have a few stations. All the stations, it's hard to see there, but at the top, north of pier, that's the fishing pier at the study site. So we have 2 locations north of the pier that we extracted from the model, one south and one at the seawall. For Francis, we do the same for Hurricane Jean. Charlie was unique. The winds were going the opposite direction, so we actually had a set down instead of a set up of the water level, and so that was very fortunate for us here. And then we also ran Matthew as well. So we're able to then, there's a sample of the domain that we have, and we've been running for a few projects. It was developed here at Florida Tech by myself and students in my lab. So we have our design water elevations from those long-term gauges. The wet season high is about 11.4 NAVD 88 inches. Dry season low is about 8.79 NAVD 88. And mean high water is about 7.2 inches above zero NAVD, to give you kind of an idea of where we are here. And then for the design wave conditions, we from the modeling, the wave period, these storm waves, the wave period is between 2 and 2.5 seconds, we'll say, and the wave height's about 27 inches. So then we want to scale all that down and rebuild scale model representations of the 3 different types of shorelines that Jake mentioned in the Florida Tech wave flume, and then start running our scale model tests of the effectiveness of these oyster bags, these oyster reefs, marsh grasses, at attenuating that wave energy. And so we run some controls. So this is a control of the seawall that you saw just built, run with a profile. We went out with a group of students and surveyed each of the sites, built a profile there. And so these are the storm waves now being run on the annual high water, and you can see as the video is running, there's a lot of reflected wave off the seawall. There's overtopping of the seawall, water's pooling behind the seawall. You can start seeing a nice scour hole appearing just in front of the seawall, just as one would expect. It was very high energy. In this case, the seawall actually failed. And when you, of course, when we looked after Matthew, the seawall at the site itself failed, and they both failed the same way. And so that was actually fortuitous for us. We go, oh, look, our model failed, and it actually failed the same way. So we're doing a good job, with our model scaling here, right? So there, right? There's a picture of that. So then the first thing we wanted to do with the seawall was to, assess this idea of this oyster reef revetment. We're calling it this ORR. Basically, we're going to stack these oyster modules in a half reef configuration directly in front of the seawall, the idea being to reduce that reflected wave. And so we built a design to test that. Again, this is the storm waves at the same high water, so the wave conditions haven't changed. And it may look very similar as you're watching this, but one thing to really notice is this reflected wave has actually been reduced quite a bit. There's not as much water splashing out of the tank, right? The floor in the lab is drier now than it was before. We've been running a few tests, but again, the overtopping is not as bad, and the seawall did not fail. It actually moved the scour hole that you kind of see drawn on the side of the tank here from the original study is no longer being formed, so it's preventing scour at the face of the seawall as well.
Same amount of water, because it's significantly different. I mean, that made
Right.
a difference. But that same
Exact same amount of water,
Wow.
exact same wave, incident wave coming in.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I said. I was like, oh, wow, this is... it's nice when the physics works out, right? So then the real goal then is to see what can we do about putting a breakwater out there as well, because in my mind, in addition to the engineering side, it's the ecology, right? We really want to be restoring, and a way to really restore oysters is to put these reefs out there and get the substrate going. So this is where the permitting issues came into place, right? I don't want to get into the permitting details, but this is huge. We have a design here. It is by no means the optimal design because permitting has restricted us to the footprint. But so we forced the footprint into the permitting. We had to shorten the design of this revetment in order to have the 3-foot manatee gap. And we had to squeeze in the breakwater, the ORB, the oyster reef breakwater, in order to meet the 10-foot limit and make the manatee gap. So typically we would never design a breakwater with such a steep face because it has a very high reflection coefficient, but we had to for this project. Again, same water level. So I apologize. The framing of this video is a bit slower than the other time-lapse videos, or maybe it's just running slower here. But again, it's the same water level and the same incident wave, and we can see a lot of wave energy is being dissipated at that breakwater as again the waves are breaking. There's still reflection off the seawall, but not nearly what we were seeing in the control. And the oyster reef breakwater is still doing its job as well. So we ran all these at low water too. I don't want to, I guess I'm running out of time. So we ran all these at low water, and at low water, this is again is the lowest water in the summer, and again same incident wave, but we've reduced the water level now, and this is really what we're liking to see here. Very little energy impacting the structure at all. And so I'll leave you all with this table of our wave reduction factors, and we're seeing fairly large wave reduction factors with the oyster reef revetment and the oyster reef breakwater. We get close to a 20% reduction in that very large wave coming in during the high water, and we get over a 50% reduction in wave height at the low water. And so, typically mean water will be somewhere in between, right? So what we're doing is we're bounding that with this project. We also ran simulations for the revetment, the natural shoreline, and I'd be happy to share that information with anyone when if you have the time or the interest.
Okay.
It's all on this presentation. I actually have like 50 slides here, so I'll leave that with you all, and you can contact me.
Questions for clarification?
Just Virginia, will all these pictures be available on the website? Please?
We will figure out how to post these videos
Okay,
in
great.
PowerPoints. Yeah.
All right. Well, do we have one more speaker? No, I think we do. Two more. Okay. Dr. Melinda Donnelly, University of Central Florida.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to come talk to you guys about a project that I've been working on to hopefully make it easier to implement living shoreline restoration. That's the overall goal of this project. I am Dr. Melinda Donnelly. I work with University of Central Florida. I do just want to comment, all of the stuff I'm presenting is a huge collaborative effort between my colleagues at UCF, Dr. Linda Walters and Dr. Kelly Keebler, as well as probably about half of the people in the room that have been out and helped and supported with these projects in some way. So just do a big thank you to everybody that's helped. So just to give you a little bit of background of kind of where I'm coming from, I started this kind of just looking at living shoreline stabilization. I was working at UCF with Dr. Linda Walters, who you guys have heard a little bit about, doing the oyster mats, and my main interest was actually the mangroves and Spartina. And we were sitting around one day, probably over a beer or a glass of wine, and thought, why don't we put this together and see what happens when we put all of this on a shoreline and see what we can do. So since actually 2007, we've done a variety of sites throughout Mosquito Lagoon and the Indian River. We've looked at different species and which species worked best. We've looked at different materials, so using mats or bags or plants only. And we've also been really interested in identifying the site-specific factors. What we found with all of these projects is that in some areas, they worked amazing. And of course, I gave you guys the good pictures here to look at. In other sites, they were horrible failures. And as scientists, we're not supposed to talk about the bad results. But for restoration, you want to, because I don't want y'all spending money and making the same mistakes that we did. So what we started looking at with our monitoring is trying to identify factors that would make living shorelines successful, as well as trying to understand the failures and figure out what went wrong and why they weren't working. So that was really kind of the inspiration behind moving forward into these more kind of decision-making tools of trying to figure out what are we going to do with all this information and how can we make it applicable. So that kind of led me to Virginia and Jane, talking with them about doing what we've basically been calling kind of shoreline surveys. So in order to do restoration, we need to know what we have. We need to be able to identify areas that need restoration, areas that are okay. We do actually have good areas in Brevard that don't need restoration, as well as kind of understanding the site-specific factors that we need to know in order to plan restoration. So our goal is by the end of next month, we will actually have all of the Brevard County shorelines surveyed. This map is from about a month ago, so we're a little bit farther along. I said so far we're at about 75% of the total 175 miles surveyed. Now that I'm finally done with teaching at UCF, I can spend more time over here in the field, so we should get that knocked out in the last couple weeks. Now, where we actually started, and the part that I'm going to focus on for today's talk, was actually the shoreline of the city of Titusville in North Brevard. We started here mainly because I am a Titusville native, and so I wanted to do something close to home and see if we could improve that area. So we did a small-scale project doing the shoreline surveys and a restoration suitability model for the city of Titusville. So the city of Titusville was a good starting point. It's only 14 miles, so it was kind of a smaller chunk before we took on the whole of Brevard County. And it allowed us to kind of refine our methods and kind of figure out what we were going to be working with. Now, what I have for you guys here, just kind of on this text side, is sort of the overall summary of what we found at Titusville, and it kind of gives you an idea of the types of data we can get out of these shoreline surveys. So, for example, when we looked at shorelines, we found that there was actually very little natural habitat left. The majority of the shoreline is actually hard armored, with either seawalls or riprap already in place, and the majority of the vegetated habitat was actually non-native vegetation. It was more Brazilian pepper and Australian pine than we saw mangroves or sea oxeye or any of our more normal wetland plants. Now, the main reason for this was the slope. In the city of Titusville, the US 1 runs almost right along the line. On the southern part, or right along the shoreline, in the north part, there's a railroad. So almost all of this shoreline was filled or diked or impounded for one of these purposes, and we ended up with a very steep slope with very severe erosion. And what this led to is really no area for the mangroves to be able to survive. Now, we combined this with our wave energy. So you guys have heard kind of multiple talks about how one of our big implications for our shorelines is the fact that they're exposed to wave energy. So we can take what our shoreline profiles were showing and combine that with predicted wave energy. Now, in Mosquito Lagoon, we kind of have two sources of waves. One coming from our nice boating channels, a beautiful place to boat, so everybody likes coming here. The second is just kind of our naturally derived waves that are going to come from wind. So we can combine that and use that to actually create what we called sort of a shoreline restoration model. So for the city of Titusville, we were able to identify kind of two potential restoration strategies, and one that we're kind of calling a hybrid, since we did find so many areas that had shoreline hardening. We wanted to find kind of a living alternative that could be kind of combined with some of those sites. So what I want to kind of show you guys now is what some of these restoration predictions were and kind of what characteristics were important for kind of guiding our suggestions. So the most minimal option would be our option one, where plants only would work. So in this scenario, we would want areas that have a minimal slope, so almost flat, like you'd find in a natural wetland. Very low wave energy, because that's what native wetland vegetation is used to, is actually low wave energy shorelines, not high wave energy shorelines. And we would expect that the existing erosion would kind of support low wave energy. So we'd expect a very small scarp, kind of less than 8 centimeters. So very, very mild erosion in this region. Now, guys, this is kind of our baseline for wetlands. And unfortunately, what we found when we compared this with our wave energy is there's very little areas in probably all of Brevard County that this is actually going to work for. Obviously, we have a lot of boating traffic, and we've had a lot of alterations to the lagoon that has actually changed how the wind moves through, which is also affecting some of the wave energy. So what we're seeing for most of our areas is something along the lines of option 2. Now, option 2 would be kind of the native wetland vegetation in the higher intertidal with some sort of low profile wave break in the front. This can be the oyster shell bags like you guys have been hearing people talk about. This can also be some sort of rocky substrate Oversight. There's lots of different little concrete modules that are being developed, but something that will help break down the wave energy where we see medium to high waves and kind of an existing erosion that is relatively moderate to severe. And really what we found in a lot of these areas is that the natural conditions have changed. They are no longer low wave energy. So providing some sort of wave break is going to be necessary throughout a lot of these areas in the lagoon. Now, our kind of most severe altered shoreline is going to fall under our option 3, which is what we call kind of terracing with plants. This also could be combined into sort of a hybrid type, where if you already had an existing wall, you could work on kind of extending a living shoreline out in front of the wall. In the areas that are found in those areas that have the very steep shoreline that's been filled and altered, that has this very large scarp, installing a retaining wall in the upper area will actually provide sort of protection for the living shoreline in the lower region and prevent that scarp from just collapsing on top and kind of burying everything. So this was our kind of solution for those areas where the shoreline had been severely altered with additional fill. Now, guys, we are working on completing the shoreline assessment for Brevard County. So like I said, we're about 75% done. So we will actually have that data available for Virginia and Jane, hopefully by the end of next month. Once we have that data, we can actually use it to start prioritizing shorelines for restoration. So figuring out where the worst damage areas are and which areas are going to be kind of most likely for this living shoreline restoration to work. We're also working with an engineer at UCF to do the wind and wave modeling for all of Brevard County. So we'll be able to incorporate that data in, and finally hopefully be able to come up with sort of a restoration suitability model using some of these similar guidelines that we did for Titusville by the end of September. So that's kind of our timeline. As long as everything goes well, we get good weather and all of those sorts of things, hopefully we can come back in October and kind of present more of these details to you guys. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions if you guys have any.
Good stuff.
Great, thank you. Okay, our last speaker is Jane Hart, environmental scientist with NRMD.
Which one's you? The first one. This one right here. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jane Hart from Brevard County Natural Resources, and for today's Living Shoreline theme meeting, I'd like to provide you some information on county projects that have been ongoing for the last 4 years, sort of give you a perspective of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. For time's sake, luckily a lot of my project partners have covered some of the projects, so I'm going to try to keep it brief and get through a lot of projects, and we can answer questions at the end. So where we started, we launched the oyster gardening project that Jake was talking about in 2013 and 2014, and we started. Actually, it was in 2014. It was approved in 2013. And 2014, we launched. One of the greatest accomplishments is that we have over 1,000 oyster gardeners have participated in that program, and we use the oysters that are produced in the oyster gardening workshops through the oyster gardening program, to build our oyster reefs. So this is where we initially started, and then we moved on into the oyster reef pilot project, and that was started in 2014. It was DEP legislative funding. It was a 2-year project and included oyster gardening. It involved installation of 3 pilot reefs in different areas of the county, one in the north part of the county, one in the central part of the county, and one in the southern end of the county, so we could determine where oyster restoration would work the best. And then there was a pilot reef monitoring study that was conducted by Dr. Linda Walters with UCF. And then there was also a oyster denitrification study to figure out what kind of ecosystem services oysters provide, because we had heard up in Chesapeake Bay that they provide a lot of denitrification benefits, and we wanted to know for Brevard County, the Indian River Lagoon specifically, what can we expect to reap those benefits in our oyster program. So this is a little wordy, but significant findings as far as the pilot reef study. Scout Island, that was our most successful oyster reef pilot site. There was natural recruitment at that site, and also gardened oysters survived. at Nickel Park, and that was in the south part of the county. Nickel Park which was in the northern part of the county. Natural recruitment was not determined there, but there were garden oysters that survived at that site. So at that site, it was determined that we would need to stock live oysters through the oyster gardening program until that site could become self-sufficient and on its own and self-sustaining. Marsh Harbor, which was in the central part of the county, it experienced fluctuations in water levels. The seasonal low left a lot of the reef exposed, and those oysters, it led to extremely low survival, and during the monitoring events, no oyster recruitment was noted at that site. So that was our least successful site, but we learned a lot from this. Implications for management, seasonal variation water. Like I mentioned, we need to consider water depth at each of our sites. Also, in the areas with no natural recruitment, it will be necessary to provide gardened oysters until they can become self-sustaining populations. And then for areas with natural recruitment, those could, if we just put out suitable substrate, that might be all that is required for a successful oyster reef to recruit, and that could be a very economical strategy for those areas. So what we really learned is site conditions and characteristics really need to be considered prior to placing oyster reefs at a site, and that is sort of what Melinda Donnelly was talking about. That's where we're focusing efforts at this point. Oyster reefs, they provide a lot of ecosystem services. They create an environment where microbes can take nitrogen and convert it into gas and bubble it out. So it's an exporting of nitrogen out of our system. They also take up nitrogen and phosphorus in their shells and tissues, and so it's a long-term storage. So they provide these beneficial water quality ecosystem services, and that's why we included them in our restoration plan at the county. So our denitrification study was performed by DRI. They're one of our project partners, and Dr. Casey Schmidt went out. He studied the reefs in Mosquito Lagoon because we don't have any existing reefs that we could study here in Brevard County. So he used Dr. Linda Walters' reefs that are restored reefs up in Mosquito Lagoon, and he looked at different ages of reefs to see if there was differences in the ecosystem services for the different ages. He ended up finding out that, yes, denitrification rates were significantly higher underneath restored reefs compared to the bare sediments. They're hotspots of microbial mass and organic carbon accumulation. So denitrification is happening at oyster reefs. His calculated denitrification rate was very similar to what that they have calculated for Chesapeake Bay. So this represents a continuous mechanism for nitrogen removal. As far as the nitrogen stored in oysters, they also took samples of oysters at each of these differently aged reef sites, and they calculated that there was a significant amount of storage in the shells and tissues, and it was considerably higher than what Chesapeake Bay had measured for their oysters. So that is also an additional benefit and for nitrogen removal. So if we calculated it out, for the Save Our Lagoon plan, the nitrogen removal benefit associated with the oyster reef living shorelines, which is on table 45 of the plan, that was based on the best information that we had at the time, based on Chesapeake Bay shoreline plantings. It didn't take into consideration any oyster reef or denitrification ecosystem services that they may provide. So if we add in the benefit of denitrification, it reduces the cost per pound of total nitrogen for this project. It goes from $473 for a pound of nitrogen per year removal to $370. And then if you add in the additional denitrification benefit and the storage in the shells and tissues, it's an additional almost 70,000 pounds of nitrogen removed, and it brings that cost down even more to a little over $100 per pound of nitrogen per year removed. So oysters are a big benefit for water quality, and that's why we are incorporating them into our plan. So where we are, this is what we are working on right now. These are projects that we are involved in, and we'll be finishing up at the end of this fiscal year. Our fiscal year ends on September 30th. So we went into a cost share project with St. Johns River Water Management to install about a half a mile of oyster reef living shorelines over 2 years. These are the sites that we have going on. We've installed 4 reefs, and we have 4 to go, and so far so good. Permitting is a challenge. We talked about that earlier. I can answer questions after this is over. But all the reefs, live oysters are provided by the oyster gardening program. So, and then at some sites where it is suitable, native salt marsh grasses are planted along the shorelines and mangroves. Then, so because in our pilot study, it became clear that we need to really consider site conditions, site-specific conditions for successful oyster reef deployment. We wanted to develop a shoreline habitat and restoration plan. And this is basically, we want to identify the enhancement opportunities. We want to encourage and expand the use of living shorelines throughout the community, and then all of this to protect our water quality. So the first one is like what Melinda Donnelly is talking about. This is the project that they are working on. UCF is our project partner. We got funding from DEP in 2016 for a 1-year project. And it's the field survey, and it's about 175 miles that they're covering. So bless their hearts. They're doing an amazing job, and they're out there on kayaks, and they're taking data points. They're taking data points every 100 feet and collecting shoreline data. And if in an undeveloped area, it may be out to every 1,000 feet. But this is information that we did not have, and this provides a critical baseline of information to start, and then we can look back and we'll know where we began and how far we've come. So this is an excellent project. Next steps, like Melinda was talking about, they're conducting a wind and wave energy analysis, and they're going to incorporate that into a geospatial model, and then we will finally, have a shoreline map that can determine what type of living shoreline configuration would be most appropriate at what site. So that project ends in the end of September, so we will have that map. Our ultimate vision with the county is to have an interactive map on our website for the general public, so that, like we had Jake and the zoo, they're working on a living shoreline demonstration site. Well, this would be sort of like an interactive demonstration. They could zoom into, and this is from the Nature Conservancy's coastalresiliency.org. You could go on their website, and New Jersey has done this for their whole state. But you can zoom in to a parcel and click on it, and it will bring up and tell you what is appropriate shoreline stabilization and enhancement method for that site. And then it would even click up a little site diagram. So I love this, and I would like to have it for Brevard County.
Okay.
I think that would be a way to get individual homeowners to be able to know what they could do and implement at their site. Okay, and then and also shell recycling, as Jake mentioned. We got a grant from DEP to do shell recycling for living shorelines. It's a 1-year project, and it's going to pay for oyster shell hauling, and community volunteers are going to be bagging oyster shell, and that's what's used for our match. And so we can get about 120,000 pounds of shell every month if that much is available, but that's how much this would pay for transportation out to our county recycling site. And we're going to need all that shell, like we were talking about, for upcoming projects. And that brings us to where we're going with the Save Our Lagoon project plan for living shorelines. Year 1 begins October 1st. It's 2 miles of shoreline per year. That's how it's divided out. Project planning is underway. We're establishing project partnerships. We have, then we'll need site selection and evaluation. That's going on. Design and permitting, and then installation and monitoring are all components of each of these projects. Each individual site has to be permitted. It isn't, so there's a lot involved. And someone had asked about permitting, and it's, Army Corps of Engineers, DEP. If we're using live oysters, that is permitted through FWC, and we have to use live native oysters because there's a genetic decline that is north of Cape Canaveral area, and we cannot cross that. They won't give us a license, so we have to stay within our Brevard County.
They who won't give us a license?
FWC. We have a special activity license for
That you're named on.
to collect and produce and release, because they're just very concerned. They don't want, like Jake had mentioned, we don't want any unintended consequences happening from something that we're doing. So they wouldn't even give us a license to use any oyster seed from any other part of the state. We have to use Indian River Lagoon, and specifically Brevard County, Sebastian area oysters.
They're also, let me just add, they're also concerned about disease resistance.
Sure.
So, there's some bad diseases out there that we have escaped
Sure,
in the lagoon, and
So at the University of Maryland's Hoyne Point Hatchery, disease-resistant oysters are $17 per thousand versus non-disease, which are $9.50. We're paying $12,000. It's a demonstration program. I got that, Jake, okay? But we're paying like $12,000 every time we get a few oysters. If you took the $215,000 total at $25, we paid $8,600 if we'd have bought them from Maryland, okay? If we're going to do this long-term, somebody needs to ask the people at FWC to tell me what the difference genetically is between an oyster from the Hoyne Point Hatchery in Tangier Island and in Brevard County. Okay?
John,
And is there a
I
benefit?
think we're going to move the discussion to the panel, and you're going to
Okay.
wrap up, and
Okay.
then we're going to need a motion to
That was-
continue our meeting
That
beyond
was my last
10:30.
slide, so
Thank you.
thank you.
Do we? Oh, we can go to 11:30. Okay, great. Okay.
I'm sorry, I got
No, that's okay. I didn't want to cut you off.
No, that was my
great.
last slide. Thank you very much for having me here, and I look forward to answering any questions
Thank
that you
you.
may have coming up.
Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break and reconvene with the panel because they need to get mic'd for the television audience. Yes.